When you're a soldier, you get used to the idea that life keeps moving back home while you're away. But nothing prepares you for betrayal, not from an enemy, but from the people who are supposed to watch over your own neighborhood. My name's Ethan, U.S. Army Infantry, and for the better part of a year, I'd been deployed overseas in a sand-blasted hellhole where the days blurred together under the weight of sweat, grit, and adrenaline. The thought of home, my quiet two-story house with a wraparound porch, the oak tree in the front yard, and the smell of my mom's old rocking chair still on the deck, was what got me through the worst nights. That house wasn't just real estate. It was mine. I'd bought it with deployment pay, fixed it up with my own hands, and paid off the mortgage before I turned 30. When I got back stateside, duffel bag slung over my shoulder and desert dust still clinging to my boots, I expected to walk into peace. Instead, I walked straight into a nightmare. The first clue something was wrong was the car in my driveway. A Tesla, not mine. My old Chevy wasn't anywhere to be seen. I figured maybe my buddy Jake had swung by to check the place out like I'd asked him to once in a while. But when I tried my key at the front door, it didn't turn. Wrong lock. I stared at it for a long moment, my pulse pounding in my ears. My hands clenched around the handle of my duffel bag. I knocked hard. A woman answered. Not a neighbor I knew, not someone I'd ever seen. She was wearing a yoga outfit, earbuds in, and she looked at me like I was the intruder. Can I help you? Yeah, I said, keeping my voice steady. You're standing in my house, she frowned. No, we're renting this place. Through the HOA, you must have the wrong address. I laughed, sharp and humorless. Lady, I bought this house 7 years ago. I've got the deed, I've got the paperwork, and I've got a key that used to work in that lock. Try again. That's when her husband showed up behind her, tall guy with a man bun and a t-shirt that said Save the Planet. He crossed his arms. The HOA rented it to us fair and square. We've got a contract. You need to leave, my blood boiled. I'd faced warlords who respected boundaries more than this smug couple. But I also knew better than to start a scene right there. Instead, I pulled out my phone, snapped pictures of the door, the lock, the Tesla, and the faces of the people standing in my home. Then I turned on my heel and walked away. The HOA, of course. Meadowbrook Estates HOA had been a thorn in my side ever since I moved in. Karen Mitchell, the president, was one of those middle-aged busybodies who thought the entire neighborhood was her kingdom. She'd hassled me about everything, the color of my shutters, the height of my grass, even the flag I flew outside. Every time I deployed, she'd act like my absence was an opportunity to tighten her grip. But this? Renting out my home while I was serving overseas? That wasn't just overstepping. That was theft. I drove straight to the HOA office. It was a prefab little building with flower beds out front and motivational posters on the walls. Karen was there, perched behind the desk in her blazer like she was running for governor. Well, well, she said, smiling that venomous smile. Back already? We didn't expect you for another month. You changed my locks, I said flatly. And you rented my house out, Karen steepled her fingers. We were simply ensuring the property didn't fall into disrepair. The community has standards, you know, and you left it vacant for nearly a year. We voted to rent it out to cover HOA expenses. I wanted to slam my fist on her desk. Instead, I leaned in close. You don't own my house. You don't control my property. And you sure as hell don't get to profit off it while I'm risking my life for this country. She sniffed. The lease is legal. You'll have to take it up with our lawyers if you disagree. That was it. The last straw. I walked out of there shaking with rage, but I wasn't alone anymore. My phone buzzed. It was Jake, my buddy from the platoon. Back in town yet? He asked. Yeah, I said. And we've got a problem. An hour later, half my old platoon was sitting in a diner booth with me, listening as I laid it all out. The locks, the renters, the smug HOA president. Their faces got darker with every word. You're telling me, said Ramirez, leaning forward, that while you were over there busting your ass, they were making money off your house? Exactly. That's messed up, said Collins. They don't get away with that. I grinned for the first time since I got home. That's what I was thinking. So, boys, you up for one more mission? The table went silent. Then Jake smirked. Ramirez cracked his knuckles. Collins laughed. And just like that, my platoon was back. Not on foreign soil this time. On home turf, we didn't need weapons or body armor. What we had was discipline, training, and a brotherhood forged in fire. And when people like Karen thought they could mess with one of us, they didn't realize they were messing with all of us. That night, we started planning. We met at dusk behind the diner, in the same rundown garage where we'd celebrated promotions and nursed bruises after drills. The old plaster smelled like motor oil and stale coffee. The fluorescent light hummed above as voices dropped into that easy, dangerous quiet only soldiers understand. We weren't in uniform. Civilian clothes, ball caps, the kind of harmless disguise that makes you look more like a backyard crew than a strike team. But we moved like a unit, no small talk, no hesitation. Ramirez brought bolt cutters, just in case. Jake had a duffel full of spare keys he'd said he'd borrowed from an old locksmith buddy. Collins had a calm look, folding a map of the neighborhood like we were about to run a reconnaissance mission. Everyone else brought whatever they could, flashlights, two-way radios, a willingness to stand between me and anyone who thought they could take what was mine. We didn't plan a bloodbath. None of us wanted that. We'd seen too much of real violence to glorify it now. What we needed was speed, surprise, and leverage. Enough pressure to make the renters and the HOA realize they were on the wrong side of the law and on the wrong side of an entire platoon's dignity. Our reconnaissance was old school. Drive-bys, observing patterns. The renters came and went at predictable times. Morning coffee, mid-afternoon jogs, an evening social hour. Karen's patrol car, she insisted on driving herself to make a point, cruised the subdivision at near sadistic regularity. On the third day, we timed the cleaners leaving. One of the renters always left the back gate latch loose while he wrestled a Labrador into the hatch. That was our window. We staged the approach like a neighborhood watch with extras. Two of the guys parked a truck with a flatbed at the curb across from my house and pretended to be fixing a loose bumper. Jake and I strolled by with our hands on a toolbox, casual and unremarkable. Ramirez, Collins, and 3 others fanned out and took positions behind hedges and mailboxes. Phones were on silent, radios tucked into pockets. The plan was to make presence count, so many familiar faces that the renters would feel surrounded and decide the easy thing was to talk. When the back gate creaked and the renter wrestled the Labrador out, we moved. No screaming. No battering rams. Jake walked up with a smile like he'd just run into an old friend. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said loud enough for Karen, who was across the lane, to hear. "We're doing a neighborhood sweep. Security thing. You folks mind if we check inside? Owner's just back in town, wants his place checked." The man's face went bland, the polite mask of someone who'd signed a contract he hadn't read. "We're renting through the HOA," he said, arms reflexively protective. "They gave us a lease." "Right," said Ramirez, stepping up behind Jake and cupping his hand as if to check the dog's collar. "Do you have ID? Lease agreement? Name on the deed? We've got neighbors concerned about squatters, theft, vandalism. Owner's back from deployment, so just making sure everything's okay." He closed the sentence with that tilt that said we were harmless but alert. The man muttered about paperwork and called his wife to confirm. They weren't buying time. They were buying horror. That bought me a minute to jog to the front, where Karen had finally noticed more people gathering. Her eyes flicked from face to face like someone trying to decide which offender to call a witch. She started snapping photos, her phone a pistol of indignation. "You can't harass my tenants!" She shrieked when she saw me approach. "We're not harassing anyone," I said, and I kept my voice cold and measured, the same voice that had ordered men into the night on foreign missions. "I'm Ethan Mendoza. This is my home. I've got the deed in my truck. I was deployed. These people are in my house without my permission. We're asking politely for their cooperation while legal channels are notified. No one needs to get hurt." There was a beat where you could hear a pin drop, neighbors watching like a jury. Karen's indignation choked. You can't just," she stammered. She fumbled for authority like a child for a parent. "That's what the sheriff's office is for," said Collins, and he already had his phone out. "We've called them. We've got a witness list. You want to do this in front of officers so it's all above board?" Fine, that was the line. For 2 reasons. First, calling law enforcement removed any claim they could make about us being vigilantes. Second, the renters had no legal right to stay once the rightful owner appeared and served notice. The two of them looked at each other, and then at the swelling crowd, neighbors, the guys from the garage, the early joggers, all the invisible social pressure that makes people do the reasonable thing. They asked for a few minutes to pack. They said they would leave with grace, collect their things, be amicable. But when the husband turned and slammed the door, the wife lingered, eyes darting, lips trembling. Please, we have a lease, she mouthed. Jake unfolded a paper and slid it through the door crack. My deed, my signature, the county seal. You have a contract with the HOA, not with me, he said softly. If you stay, you risk a trespass charge. We've got the courtesy of giving you time to leave, but the owner's presence makes it a bit different. Karen started filming, calling it a citizen's arrest on social media, as if she were doing public service. She shouted that she'd call the police, that she'd call the board, that she'd sue. It sounded like a bad radio drama. The renters, visibly shaken, started stuffing clothes into a duffel. The dog whined, "We didn't shove. We didn't break doors." We showed them the reality. A dozen steady faces, someone who owned the house standing on his porch, a neighborhood watching, a deputy on the way, legal papers visible, and the knowledge that continuing to occupy someone else's home would be calamitous and ultimately humiliating. When the deputy arrived, 10 minutes felt like an hour, but it was 10. He moved through the crowd with that procedural patience you can only respect. He took statements, examined my paperwork, listened to Karen's accusations that the HOA had authority. He looked at Karen like most people looked at a mosquito, annoyed and ultimately inconsequential. "Sir," he told me after a long minute, "we'll need you to sign a reclamation notice. We'll ask them to vacate immediately. If they refuse, we'll make arrests for trespassing." She tried a last-ditch tactic, pleading poverty, claiming vulnerability. The deputy listened, nodded, and told them the options: leave now voluntarily and no criminal record, or stay and face arrest. The choice was obvious. They packed the Labrador into the Tesla, hunched with anxiety, one hand over the dog's head like you comfort a guilty pet. Karen filmed herself delivering a keynote about due process as she stood outside the house. Later, that clip would be played at HOA meetings, edited and magnified into something it wasn't. The renters left, slamming the trunk, glancing once more at the porch as if to memorize the steps they'd been on illegally. When the dust settled, I stood in the doorway with my chest heaving, not from exertion but from adrenaline. My platoon crowded in front of me, shoulders brushing, silent approval and relief exchanged in small gestures. Ramirez clapped me on the shoulder with a grin that had a soldier's bluntness. "Nice and clean," he said. "No broken windows. No broken people. We'd avoided a mess. We'd avoided the worst." And yet the message had been delivered loud and clear. You don't steal from one of us, not when we're home. Karen retreated to her office that night like a general licking her wounds. She called lawyers she'd bragged about, flamethrowed on the neighborhood app about harassment and vigilantism, posted videos of alleged intimidation. The HOA's inbox filled with angry emails. The board, for once, sounded less sure. A lawyer from the county called asking for our deed copies and copies of the lease the renters had signed with the HOA. I sent everything. The legal dominoes were beginning to line up. We celebrated that night with beers at Jake's. A quiet thing like veterans do. No parade, no brass band, just laughter and stories. Each one quieter than the last because the memory of sand and dust still lingered. We'd acted in defense of a brother, and that was enough. We'd stood together on home soil for the first time in a long while, and the solidarity had the weight of iron. But the fight wasn't over. Karen would come back with paperwork and cameras and petty vendettas. The board might attempt to obscure liability with contracts and clauses. There could be court filings, injunctions, and drawn-out legal processes designed to suck time and money. I knew that the next phase would be relentless: paperwork and patience, legal filings, and community outreach. My platoon had done the part no lawyer could do: make it clear we wouldn't be pushed around. We slept that night knowing one thing: the house was mine again. The locks were being changed back, and the porch light burned steady like a beacon. The next morning would bring letterheads, subpoenas, and perhaps a courtroom. But it would also bring a cup of coffee on my own kitchen table, a dog that slept at the foot of my bed, and the knowledge that when the world tried to take what was mine, my brothers would stand with me. We were ready for the paperwork fight. We were ready for the long game. But it had felt good, damn good, to reclaim the threshold by force of presence, by the weapon of unity forged in faraway sands. And as the sun rose over the house that had stood through wars of its own, I knew the story wasn't about the renters, or even Karen. It was about a soldier coming home and finding his place intact because the people who mattered most had his back. The last chapter played out like something between a courtroom drama and a backyard neighborhood reunion, and I learned that victories seldom come in a single thunderclap. They arrive as 1,000 small things piling up until the whole house of cards collapses. After the security stunt and the deputy's last warning, the HOA tried paperwork. They sent letters thick with legalese, petitions that read like threats, and notices about community standards that were frankly laughable next to county records. But the neighbors were changing. The message had spread. You don't mess with one of ours and expect to walk away unscathed. I started by doing exactly what the county clerk recommended, documenting everything. Every call, every letter, every knock at the door was logged. I scanned photos of the rented-in furniture and the Tesla. I saved copies of the HOA's agreement with those renters, and I printed receipts from the deployment benefit checks that proved the mortgage history. My cousin, the lawyer, helped stitch it together into a neat, unforgiving packet. We filed a formal complaint with the county and scheduled a civil hearing to quiet the nonsense once and for all. Meanwhile, the real pressure came quietly and socially. A handful of formerly silent neighbors began to show up on my porch, one by one, not to gloat, but to apologize. "We were scared of Karen," Mrs. Henderson said, wringing her hands. "We'll sign anything you need." An older couple who'd asked to remain anonymous handed me a typed affidavit about Karen's pattern of intimidation. Someone mailed a stack of receipts proving HOA funds had been spent on what looked suspiciously like personal projects. A friend from work offered to run a banner on a local news aggregator about HOA accountability. The little acts accumulated into momentum. Karen predictably reacted like someone losing a grip. She posted a video every night on the neighborhood app, edited, theatrical, full of outrage and misdirection. She accused me of staging a hostile takeover, claimed my platoon were thugs, and tried to paint the homeowners who supported me as traitors to the community. It was pathetic and transparent. People watched it and rolled their eyes. The local paper ran an inquiry. An investigative reporter called, and suddenly the story had legs beyond our cul-de-sac. When the county hearing finally came, the community center was packed. I sat with my lawyer, my platoon in the rows behind me like a quiet contingent of witnesses, and a stack of affidavits on the table that would have made any bureaucrat sit up straight. The HOA's lawyer, a man with expensive cufflinks and a rehearsed frown, opened with a long speech about governance and bylaws. Karen stood in the back with the faint halo she always tried to project, clipboard glued to her chest. We responded with deeds, dated records, witness statements, and receipts that showed the HOA had overstepped repeatedly. The judge flipped through the documents with a face that suggested she'd seen worse, but she was not impressed with hollow authority. When the HOA attempted to argue that their leasing contract gave them emergency powers over abandoned properties, my cousin handed the judge a county statute that made clear what abandoned officially meant. It didn't apply to a home with an active mortgage and a registered owner who had a deployment record on file. The bottom line was simple. The HOA had no legal basis to rent out an owned property. They had failed to follow notification rules, and their emergency measures were, at best, sloppy and at worst, fraudulent. The judge ordered the HOA to pay restitution for the months the house had been occupied, to cover the costs of changed locks and repairs, and to issue a public apology. More importantly, she granted an injunction preventing the HOA board members from entering my property or initiating any further unilateral actions without clear legal process. The judge's words were measured, but they cut like a blade. Organizations that purport to police neighborhoods must follow the law. They are not above it. After the hearing, there was relief so big and wide it felt like a physical thing in the air. Karen's face was small and pinched when she left the courtroom. The board tried to spin it in the app. A partial victory will appeal, but most residents had already seen through the veneer. The local paper printed the judge's order, and a week later the HOA's bank account showed withdrawals flagged by internal auditors. Rumors started that the board had misappropriated funds. At least one board member resigned rather than fall under the microscope. Karen found herself the subject of an ethics inquiry, and that was the beginning of the unraveling she'd always feared. I didn't want blood. I wanted my house back and the dignity of everyone who'd been bullied by a clipboard and thin suits. The restitution covered more than repairs. It paid for some repairs to the subdivision's neglected drainage, funded a neighborhood safety seminar, and paid for a community fund to help veterans in the area. I volunteered time at those seminars because I believed the community should become something better, not simply swap one tyrant for another. There were quieter victories, too. A neighbor who once refused to meet my eye stopped by with a box of cookies and a mumbled apology. A woman who'd been fined for a birdhouse finally put it back up with a grin and a shrug. Kids again left their bikes unlocked on warm springs afternoons. People spoke in the street. It was simple and ordinary, and it tasted like a life recovered. Karen left town in the way bitter people leave, theatrically and under a cloud. She packed her things the week after the judgment, her SUV loaded with boxes and the same old clipboard tucked into the front seat, like she couldn't bear to leave the symbol of her power behind. No one came out to wave. The new board that assembled was a quiet group of neighbors interested in governance, not dominion. They changed the bylaws to require more transparency, limited the board's emergency powers, and installed a legal review committee to prevent any future hijinks. It wasn't revenge so much as repair. My platoon dispersed back into their lives. Some went back to work, some pursued schooling, some visited families they hadn't seen in years. We met once more on the porch the night the restraining order was finalized, a small, rough celebration of pizza and stale beer. We joked, we remembered, and we toasted in low voices to the absurd, fragile thing that is home. I told them the house would always have an open door for them. They grinned and said the same for me. In the weeks that followed, I fixed what had been changed without my consent. The paint returned to its old blue, my grandfather's rocking chair came back to the porch where the afternoon sun warmed it, and the photos were rehung with crooked care. I laughed at the ridiculousness of the throw pillows the renters had left behind and donated them to a thrift store. The Tesla never reappeared. People asked me if I'd do it again. Gather the guys, walk down the street, stare down the kind of petty tyranny that thinks a clipboard equals power. I don't romanticize confrontation. I know the danger of escalation and the cost of anger. But there are moments when action is necessary, when sitting back and filing more paperwork only hands the moral high ground to those who abuse it. What I did was not about drama. It was about reclaiming what was mine in a way that made the neighborhood safer and more honest for everyone. The last thing I did before I took off my boots and sat down at my kitchen table, the table where I'd once polished my deployment pack and later signed restitution receipts, was write a short letter to the HOA with a copy to the county. I thanked them for the opportunity to clarify the boundaries between authority and ownership and urged them to remember that community service is about service, not dominion. It felt almost naive to write such a thing, but it was the kind of record I wanted in the book of this place. Max slept at my feet as I sealed the envelope. Outside, a kid laughed while his dog barked, a bright, ordinary sound that once would have been the trigger for a complaint. Now it was part of the soundtrack of a neighborhood that had learned its lesson. The house was mine again, not because of force alone, but because people finally chose to stand on the side of right, not fear. In the end, I found out something important. Home isn't only the walls or the porch or the oak tree. Home is the fact that when the world tilts away, there are people who will step in, not because of obligation, but because you once stepped for them. And if you've ever had brothers in arms, you know what that kind of loyalty looks like when it's brought back home.